Two cultures, one people. Exploring the history, demographics, and cultural divergence of African American life from slavery to hip-hop. Chapter 1. The Ocean Between Them. Introduction. Two worlds formed in bondage. There is a story about African Americans that rarely gets told in full. It is not the story of a single people with a single experience. It is the story of two distinct cultures, shaped by different soils, different masters, different white neighbors, different cities, and different centuries of influence, that share a common origin in chains, but diverged in ways that still echo today. To understand where Black America stands now, its triumphs, its fractures, its music, its pathologies, and its genius, you have to go back. Not just to slavery, not just to the Civil War. You have to go back to the people who were already in America before the Great Migrations, and the people who came after. You have to look at the land they lived on, the culture that surrounded them, and the invisible education that every people absorbs from those around them, for better or for worse. This is a story about culture. And culture, as the economist and historian Thomas Sowell has spent a lifetime arguing, is perhaps the most powerful force in human history. More powerful than race. More powerful, even, than law. Culture determines what a people believes about work, about family, about education, about violence, about honor, about time. And for African Americans, a people forcibly removed from their original cultures and planted into someone else's, the question of which culture took root, and why, is one of the most consequential questions in American history. We will follow that question from the slave ships to the plantation fields, from the cities of the North to the cotton rows of the Deep South, through Reconstruction and the Great Migration, through jazz and blues, through the Civil Rights Movement, through crack cocaine and mass incarceration, and finally, to the recording studios of Atlanta and Compton, where a specific vision of Black identity, forged in the Southern experience, became the dominant cultural export of an entire generation. This is not a story of victims and villains. It is a story of human beings shaped by their circumstances, and occasionally, triumphantly, rising above them. Let us begin. Chapter 2. The cargo that came from different places. The origins of African Americans in the New World. The first Africans to arrive on the shores of what would become the United States did not arrive as a unified people. Africa is a continent of thousands of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and civilizations as varied as Europe. The Wolof of Senegal, the Igbo of Nigeria, the Yoruba, the Mandinka, the Akan. These were not one people. They had different religions, different social structures, different relationships to war and trade and family. The slave trade took people from across West and Central Africa, primarily from the coasts of present-day Senegal, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, and Angola, and scattered them across the New World. The distribution was not random. Different colonial powers, and then different American regions, tended to draw from different parts of Africa, at different times. This matters because it means that the African Americans of South Carolina, where the Gullah people preserved remarkable traces of their West African roots, had a somewhat different ethnic origin than those of Virginia, or Louisiana, or Maryland. But here is what is most important for our story. Whatever cultural inheritance these Africans carried across the Atlantic was systematically, brutally, and often deliberately destroyed. Enslaved people were separated from their families, their tribes, their languages, their priests, and their traditions. The slave system in America was perhaps the most thorough cultural erasure in human history. What filled that void was the culture of those around them. The culture of the white Americans who enslaved them, who fed them, clothed them, disciplined them, worshipped alongside them, and in some cases had children with them. And here is where the story of North and South begins to split. Because the white culture of the American South was profoundly different from the white culture of the American North. And according to Thomas Sowell, and this is one of the most controversial and consequential arguments in all of American social history, the culture that Black Americans absorbed in the South was not a neutral culture. It was a culture that had its own distinct values, its own relationship to honor and violence and work and education. A culture that Sowell traces back not to Africa, but to the borderlands of Britain. Chapter 3: The Scots-Irish Hypothesis. In his 2005 book Black Rednecks and White Liberals, Thomas Sowell advanced a thesis that shocked many readers, both black and white. He argued that the cultural patterns most often associated with the worst outcomes in poor black communities, a disdain for academic achievement, a hair-trigger sense of personal honor, a tendency toward violence over perceived disrespect, an ethic of leisure over industry, sexual irresponsibility, and a distrust of commerce and education, did not originate in Africa. They originated in the White South. And the White South, Sowell argued, did not invent these values either. They inherited them from the people who settled the American backcountry in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Scots-Irish. The people of the Scottish lowlands and the borderlands between England and Scotland, known as the Ulster Scots after many of them settled in Northern Ireland before emigrating to America. These were people who had lived for centuries in a war zone. The Anglo-Scottish border was one of the most violent places in Europe for hundreds of years, raided, re-raided, plagued, and perpetually unstable. In that environment, certain values were adaptive: a fierce, almost paranoid pride, a readiness to fight at the slightest provocation, a deep suspicion of government and formal institutions, a culture of clan loyalty over civic loyalty, an orientation toward cattle herding rather than crop cultivation, because cattle can be moved when raiders come, crops cannot. These were not bad people. They were people shaped by a brutal environment, and they brought those values with them to America. The Scots-Irish settled disproportionately in the Appalachian backcountry, in the hills of Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and what would become West Virginia. They were the people who became the archetypal Southern redneck, a term that, in its original usage, referred to sunburned necks from outdoor labor, and carried connotations of poor white rural culture. Their values permeated Southern culture broadly, including, over time, the culture of the black people who lived and worked among them. Sowell is careful to note that he is not making a racial argument. He is making a cultural argument. These patterns are not genetic. They are learned. They are transmitted from one generation to the next through daily life, through what is praised and what is punished, through what is seen as honorable and what is seen as shameful. And in the American South, where enslaved black people were surrounded by, and in many ways absorbed into, a white culture shaped by these Scots-Irish values, those values took root. Chapter 4: The South they were born into. To understand how cultural transmission actually worked in the antebellum South, you have to understand what life on a plantation actually looked like, not from the perspective of the master's house, but from the totality of the community. Plantations were, in many ways, self-contained worlds. There was the master's family. There were the enslaved black workers. And depending on the size and region of the plantation, there was often remarkably intimate daily contact between these groups, particularly between white women and black domestic workers, and between white children and black children. The historian Eugene Genovese, whose magisterial work Jordan role examined the world the slaves made, was struck by the paradox of the plantation. It was a system of unimaginable brutality and degradation, and yet within it, human relationships formed. White children were nursed by black women. Black and white children played together until the age when racial hierarchy reasserted itself. Enslaved workers adopted the religion of their masters, Christianity, and made it profoundly their own. They also absorbed the broader cultural atmosphere of Southern life, the oral tradition over the written one, the ethic of communal solidarity, taking care of your own, over individual striving. The sense that working too hard for a master's benefit was not virtuous but humiliating, a value that, in the context of slavery, made complete psychological sense, and yet would persist long after slavery ended. They absorbed the Southern relationship to time, what sociologists have sometimes called event time versus clock time. In agricultural, community-based societies, life is organized around events: the harvest, the Sunday service, the birth, the death. In industrial, commercial societies, life is organized around the clock. Northern culture was already moving toward clock time in the 19th century. Southern culture, black and white alike, remained organized around events for much longer. They absorbed the Southern sense of personal honor. In a culture without strong civic institutions, your reputation was your only protection. An insult could not be tolerated because to tolerate it was to invite further predation. This logic, which anthropologists call an honor culture, produced the Southern tradition of dueling among whites, and produced patterns of interpersonal violence in black communities that persist to this day. None of this was inevitable. None of this was genetic. It was environmental. It was the water they swam in. Chapter 5. The North that received them, and the North that was already there. Free black communities before the Great Migration. While the story of Southern black life was playing out on plantations and in the Black Belt, something very different was happening in the North. Free black communities had existed in northern cities since the colonial era. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Cincinnati, all had significant free black populations by the early 19th century. These were not people who had just escaped slavery. Many of them had been free for generations, and the culture they had built reflected their environment. The white culture of the Northeast, particularly of New England and the Mid-Atlantic, was shaped by a very different set of European antecedents than the Scots-Irish backcountry. The Puritans and their descendants brought to America an almost obsessive relationship with literacy, thrift, industry, self-discipline, and communal moral accountability. Max Weber famously called it the Protestant ethic, the idea that hard work, frugality, and sobriety were signs of God's favor and were, in themselves, morally virtuous. New England culture prized education. Towns were legally required to establish schools. Harvard was founded in 1636, just 16 years after the Pilgrims landed. The literacy rate in New England by the time of the Revolution was among the highest in the world. The commercial culture of the Northeast prized punctuality, contractual reliability, and deferred gratification. These were not natural virtues, they were cultural ones, cultivated over generations. And the free black communities of the Northeast absorbed this culture, not without resistance, not without the ongoing indignity of racism, but they absorbed it. By the early 19th century, cities like Philadelphia had black churches, black mutual aid societies, black newspapers, black schools, and black professional classes. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in Philadelphia in 1816 by Richard Allen, was not just a religious institution, it was a complete social infrastructure for black community life, organized around values of literacy, self-improvement, and collective uplift. Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most towering black intellectual of the 19th century, was a man deeply shaped by Northern culture. His emphasis on education, on argument, on civic engagement, on the possibility of moral persuasion, these were Northern values, absorbed and elevated. The black abolitionist movement was, in large part, a Northern black movement. It spoke the language of Northern white culture, of rights, of contracts, of constitutional argument, of moral suasion through reason and evidence. This was a different world from the South, and it was producing a different kind of black culture. Chapter 6. Reconstruction and its promises. What was won, and what was taken back? The Civil War ended slavery. And for a brief, luminous, and ultimately crushed moment, it seemed as though the cultural divide between North and South might be bridged, and bridged on Northern terms. Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877, was in many ways the most radical social experiment in American history. The federal government, backed by the Union Army, enforced black civil rights across the South. Black men voted. Black men held office. Black men served in state legislatures, in the U.S. Congress, as lieutenant governors and sheriffs and judges. And the institutions of Northern culture poured into the South. The Freedmen's Bureau established thousands of schools. The American Missionary Association built colleges. Black churches expanded their social role. Literacy rates among black Southerners, which had been near zero under slavery, teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most Southern states, began to rise rapidly. This was not, as the Lost Cause mythology would have it, a period of chaos and corruption. Historians like Eric Foner have documented that the Reconstruction governments were, by the standards of the era, remarkably capable and genuinely committed to building inclusive public institutions. But Reconstruction was violently, systematically dismantled. The Compromise of 1877 removed federal troops from the South. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist terrorist organizations had been murdering black political leaders, burning schools, and intimidating voters since the moment Reconstruction began. Without federal protection, the project collapsed. What followed, the era of Jim Crow, sharecropping, convict leasing, lynching, and legal apartheid, was, from a cultural standpoint, a kind of re-immersion. Black Southerners were re-embedded in the economic and social structures of the white South, now without even the ambiguous protections of the plantation system. They were sharecroppers tied to land they didn't own, subject to debt peonage that was, in practice, barely distinguishable from slavery. The cultural consequences were profound. The brief expansion of literacy and civic participation was beaten back. The Southern honor culture, with its violence, its fatalism, its suspicion of formal institutions, reasserted its dominance over black Southern life. Meanwhile, in the North, free black communities continued to build. They were not free from racism, far from it. Northern racism was real, pervasive, and often vicious. But it operated differently. It did not prevent literacy. It did not prevent property ownership. It did not prevent the construction of parallel black institutions organized around Northern cultural values. The gap between these two black worlds was growing. Chapter 7. The Great Migration, North meets South. 1910 to 1970, the largest internal migration in American history. Between approximately 1910 and 1970, roughly 6 million black Americans left the South and moved to northern and western cities. They went to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Oakland. They went looking for industrial jobs, for freedom from Jim Crow terror, for the simple dignity of being able to vote. And they found all of these things, partially, imperfectly, and always in the shadow of racism. But they found them. The Great Migration is one of the most studied and celebrated events in African American history. What is less often discussed is what happened when two distinct black cultures, the established Northern black culture and the newly arrived Southern black culture, collided in the same cities and often the same neighborhoods. The Northern black community had been building its institutions for generations. Cities like Chicago had thriving black business districts, the Black Metropolis, along South Side Chicago's State Street corridor. There were black-owned banks, insurance companies, newspapers, hospitals. The Chicago Defender was one of the most influential newspapers in America, black or white. This established black community had a culture. It valued education and professional attainment. It valued church membership and civic respectability. It valued what historians have called the politics of racial uplift, the idea that by demonstrating black achievement and virtue, the race as a whole could advance. When the Southern migrants arrived, hundreds of thousands of them, often desperately poor, with little formal education, shaped by a very different cultural world, the collision was not always comfortable. Many Northern black families described feeling that the migrants were damaging the reputation they had worked so hard to build. Southern black migrants were seen, sometimes quite unfairly, as loud, as undisciplined, as too comfortable with violence, as insufficiently attuned to the codes of urban industrial life. The migrants, for their part, sometimes found Northern black culture cold, pretentious, and insufficiently soulful. Isabel Wilkerson, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning work The Warmth of Other Suns, captured this tension brilliantly through her three protagonists. Migrants from different parts of the South who found in the North not just opportunity and racism, but a complex internal black social world they had to navigate. What happened, over time, was a kind of mixing. But it was not an equal mixing. The industrial jobs that the migrants came for were real, and they were transformative. Black men who had been sharecroppers became auto workers. Black women who had been domestic servants became factory workers. The material conditions of millions of black Americans improved dramatically. And yet the cultural patterns that the migrants brought with them, the honor culture, the oral tradition, the ambivalence about formal education, the extended family versus nuclear family household structures, did not simply dissolve in the northern environment. They persisted, they mixed with northern black culture, and they changed it. Chapter 8: The Culture of Success, Northern Black Achievement. What the data show about cultural divergence. Thomas Sowell has spent decades cataloging what happens when different ethnic and cultural groups encounter the same economic opportunities. His findings consistently point in the same direction. Cultural values predict outcomes more reliably than race, and often more reliably than current economic conditions. He has documented, for example, that the children and grandchildren of Caribbean black immigrants, particularly from Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, consistently outperform not just American-born black Americans, but often American-born white Americans, in terms of educational attainment, income, and occupational status. Why? Sowell argues it is cultural. Caribbean black culture, forged under British colonial rule but with somewhat different dynamics than American slavery, maintained stronger traditions of literacy, commerce, and small business ownership. The West Indian immigrants who came to American cities brought those values with them, and those values produced different outcomes. Colin Powell, Eric Holder, Shirley Chisholm, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Malcolm X. Many of the most prominent figures in 20th-century black American life were West Indian immigrants or the children of West Indian immigrants, a group that represented a tiny fraction of the black American population. Sowell sees this not as evidence of racial difference, but as evidence of cultural difference. The same genome, in a different cultural context, produces different outcomes. The same logic applies within American black culture. The northern black establishment, concentrated in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, produced, over the 19th and early 20th centuries, a remarkable array of scholars, professionals, lawyers, doctors, and leaders. W. E. B. Du Bois, who grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, earned a doctorate from Harvard and a second doctorate from the University of Berlin. He was a product of northern black culture at its most aspirational. Booker T. Washington, who was born into slavery in Virginia, represented a different tradition, the emphasis on practical vocational training, self-sufficiency, and economic development from the bottom up. He was shaped by the Southern experience, and his philosophy reflected it. The tension between Du Bois and Washington, between the Northern model of political rights and intellectual development and the Southern model of practical economics and patient accommodation, was one of the defining debates of early 20th century black America. And it was, in many ways, a debate between two cultures as much as two strategies. Chapter 9: The Music of Where You're From. Blues, Jazz, Gospel, and the Sound of Two Black Americas. Before we go further into the political and sociological story, we need to talk about music. Because in African American life, music is not entertainment. It is documentation. It is theology. It is psychology. It is the most faithful record of what a culture actually feels and believes. And the music of Black America tells the story of two cultures as clearly as any sociological study. The blues was Southern. It came from the Mississippi Delta, the most southern place in America, the region of the most intense poverty, the most brutal racial violence, the most complete white domination of black life. The blues was the sound of a people with very limited external options developing an extraordinary internal life. Listen to the original Delta blues, Robert Johnson, Son House, Charlie Patton, and you hear something almost unbearable in its honesty. The blues is not optimistic. It does not tell you that things will get better if you work hard and follow the rules. It tells you that life is suffering, that love will betray you, that the devil is at the crossroads, and that all you can do is sing about it. This is not a pathological music. It is a profoundly honest music, honest about the conditions of life for black Southerners under Jim Crow. It is also a music deeply rooted in the honor culture of the South. The blues man is a wanderer, a lover, a fighter, someone who lives by his wits and his charisma. He is not a reliable employee or a civic institution builder. He is a folk hero for a world where those institutions are not accessible to you anyway. Jazz was different. Jazz was Northern, or rather, it was what happened when Southern black music, particularly from New Orleans, which was its own cultural hybrid, moved north and encountered urban sophistication. Jazz in its mature form, the jazz of Duke Ellington, of Thelonious Monk, of Charlie Parker, of Miles Davis, was a music of extraordinary complexity, discipline, and intellectual ambition. It required years of formal study. It was performed in formal settings. It engaged with European harmonic structures while maintaining African rhythmic roots. It demanded of its practitioners exactly the kind of disciplined artistic development that Northern Black culture demanded of its members in other fields. Duke Ellington, who grew up in Washington, D.C. in a middle-class black family, embodied Northern Black culture's highest aspirations. He was meticulous about his appearance, his diction, his public image. He composed extended orchestral works and performed at Carnegie Hall. He was, as the writer Albert Murray observed, a man who understood that the blues were the foundation but that you built on that foundation. Gospel music bridged the two worlds, born in the black church, which was present in both North and South, but with different textures. Northern gospel, as developed by Thomas Dorsey in Chicago, was structured, harmonic, and aspirational. Southern gospel was rawer, more spontaneous, more deeply rooted in the call and response traditions of the plantation church. When Aretha Franklin sang, and she was the daughter of a prominent Detroit minister, raised in Northern Black church culture but trained on the Southern gospel sound her father had brought from Alabama, you could hear both worlds in her voice simultaneously. Chapter 10. The Post-War Years and the Changing North. The 1950s, 60s, and the Fracturing of the Northern Dream. Music. Urban, tense. A distant siren. After World War II, Northern Black life reached something like its apex, and then began to unravel in ways that nobody fully understood at the time. The immediate post-war years were good years for the black working class. The industrial economy was booming. Union membership, while deeply contested and often reluctantly extended to black workers, was rising. A black auto worker in Detroit in 1955 could earn wages that supported a family, buy a house, in a restricted neighborhood, but a house, send his children to school, and participate in civic life. The sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, in his 1957 work Black Bourgeoisie, documented the rise of a black middle class in the North with both celebration and concern. He celebrated its achievement. He worried that it was becoming too imitative of white middle-class consumer culture, too focused on status and display, insufficiently grounded in the serious intellectual and civic traditions of earlier Northern Black culture. In retrospect, Frazier was seeing something real. The Northern Black culture that had been built on the values of self-improvement, civic institution building, and racial uplift was beginning to face pressures from multiple directions. The first was demographic. The Great Migration was still ongoing through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The Southern migrants continued to arrive, and the neighborhoods into which they arrived became increasingly concentrated, increasingly poor, increasingly cut off from the economic mainstream. The second was structural. Deindustrialization, the gradual destruction of the manufacturing economy that had provided the material foundation for Northern Black working-class life, began in the late 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s and 70s. The auto plants closed, the steel mills closed, the stockyards closed, the jobs that had made the Great Migration worthwhile began to disappear. The third was political. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a triumph of Northern Black values applied to Southern Black conditions. The movement's language was the language of constitutional rights, of nonviolent moral witness, of legal argument. It was, in its deepest structure, a Northern cultural project, even when it was being carried out by Southern Black people. But as the 60s went on, another voice emerged, one that was angrier, more radical, more Southern in its emotional register if not its geography. The Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, the urban rebellions of 1964, 1965, 1967, and 1968, these represented something different. They represented the rage of people who had migrated north in search of a promised land that had not fully materialized. And in the aftermath of that rage, in the burned neighborhoods, the fled businesses, the abandoned institutions, something happened to Northern black culture that would take decades to fully understand. Chapter 11. The Welfare State and the Family. How Policy Interacted with Culture. Thomas Sowell, Charles Murray, and a number of other social scientists have argued, controversially, but with substantial supporting evidence, that the expansion of the welfare state in the 1960s had profoundly destructive effects on black family structure, particularly in the urban North. This is a complex argument that is often misunderstood, so it deserves careful examination. Before the Great Society programs of the 1960s, the black family, despite slavery, despite Jim Crow, despite poverty, was remarkably intact. In 1960, roughly 78% of black families had two parents present. This was lower than the white rate, but not dramatically so, and it had been relatively stable through decades of hardship. The scholar Herbert Gutman, in his 1976 work The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, documented this with painstaking archival research. He found that even in the immediate aftermath of slavery, in the 1870s and 1880s, black families showed strong evidence of stable two-parent household structures. Formerly enslaved people searched frantically for family members who had been sold away. They legalized marriages that had not been recognized under slavery. The point is that the family structures that are sometimes attributed to slavery were not, in fact, primarily the legacy of slavery. They developed later. What changed in the 1960s? Several things at once. The Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, as it was structured in the 1960s, effectively penalized marriage. Benefits were reduced or eliminated if a husband was present in the household. This created financial incentives for a particular kind of family structure, a single mother with children, supported by the state. Simultaneously, deindustrialization was destroying the economic foundation of black male breadwinning in northern cities. A man who cannot support a family has diminished incentive, and diminished social leverage, to form one. The interaction of these forces, policy incentives, economic collapse, and the cultural patterns brought from the South, produced, over the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a catastrophic collapse in black family formation, particularly in urban northern communities. By 1990, more than 60% of black children in the United States were born to single mothers. In urban areas, in the housing projects of Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, the rate was even higher. The effects were devastating and are well documented. Children raised without fathers are, on average, more likely to be poor, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to repeat the cycle. This is not a statement about race. The same patterns hold for white children raised in single-parent households. It is a statement about family structure. What is notable, from a cultural standpoint, is that the collapse was most severe in the urban North, the very region where black family and civic culture had been strongest. The South, in some ways paradoxically, maintained higher rates of black family stability through this period, partly because the Southern black church remained a more dominant social institution. This is one of history's ironies. The North, which had given black Americans their greatest opportunities, became the site of their greatest cultural crisis. Chapter 12. The Rise of the Crack Era. The 1980s and the Destruction of the Inner City. If deindustrialization and the collapse of the black family were the slow-moving disasters of the 1970s, crack cocaine was the fast-moving catastrophe of the 1980s. Crack, a cheap, smokable form of cocaine, arrived in American cities in the mid-1980s with devastating speed. It was extraordinarily addictive, it was inexpensive, and it created, almost overnight, a massive illegal economy in the very neighborhoods that had already been hollowed out by deindustrialization and family collapse. For young black men with no fathers at home, no industrial jobs available, and surrounded by a culture that had lost much of its institutional scaffolding, the crack economy offered something powerfully attractive: money, status, and a sense of masculine identity and power. The violence that accompanied the crack trade was almost incomprehensible in its scale. In cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia, Homicide rates among young black men in the late 1980s reached levels that would have been considered wartime casualties in another context. The crack era did several things to black culture simultaneously. It decimated entire communities, not just the people who used and sold crack, but the working and middle-class black families who were caught in the crossfire, who fled if they could, who stayed and built their lives around protecting their children from the mayhem outside. It massively expanded the incarcerated black male population. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, with its notorious disparity between sentences for crack cocaine, associated with black urban communities, and powder cocaine, associated with white suburban ones, sent hundreds of thousands of young black men to prison. This further disrupted family formation and community stability. And it produced a cultural response that would change the world. Chapter 13. The Birth of Hip-Hop. South Bronx, 1973. A culture is born. Hip-hop was born in the rubble. Specifically, it was born in the South Bronx of the early 1970s, one of the most devastated urban landscapes in American history. Robert Moses's Cross Bronx Expressway had plowed through the heart of the South Bronx in the 1950s and 60s, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents and destroying the social fabric of dozens of neighborhoods. Arson, landlords burning buildings for insurance money, had turned block after block into ruins. Unemployment was catastrophic. In 1973, a teenager named Clive Campbell, who went by the name DJ Kool Herc, threw a party in the recreation room of his apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. He brought 2 turntables and a collection of records. And he discovered something, that if you extended the break, the percussive instrumental section of a song, by switching between 2 copies of the same record, you could create something new. That discovery was the foundation of hip-hop. What followed, the 4 elements of hip-hop that emerged over the next decade in New York City: DJing, MCing, rapping, breakdancing, and graffiti, was one of the most extraordinary cultural explosions in American history. A generation of young people in devastated neighborhoods, with no institutional resources and no economic opportunities, invented an entirely new art form. Early hip-hop was Northern black culture in its most urgent form. It was urban, literate, witty, politically aware, and deeply concerned with both individual excellence and community condition. The great MCs of the old school, Mel Mel, Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, KRS-One, were verbal masters who demanded that their audiences keep up with complex rhyme schemes and dense cultural references. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's 1982 masterpiece, The Message, was as direct a piece of social documentary as anything produced by the black literary tradition. It described life in the ghetto with unflinching honesty, the poverty, the violence, the hopelessness. But it did so from the perspective of a narrator who was observing these conditions, who was appalled by them, who was warning about them. "Don't push me 'cause I'm close to the edge," Mel Mel rapped. "I'm trying not to lose my head." The key word is trying. There was still a self trying to maintain dignity in the face of chaos. There was still a distinction between the person and the pathology. Chapter 14. The Southern Insurgency. Gangsta Rap and the New Masculine Identity. The late 1980s produced a seismic shift in hip-hop, one that mapped almost perfectly onto the cultural divide between Northern and Southern Black America. Gangsta rap emerged simultaneously on the West Coast, in South Los Angeles, in Compton, and began to make its way into the culture. NWA's 1988 album Straight Outta Compton was not a warning about pathology. It was a celebration of it. Or rather, it was something more complicated, a raw, unmediated expression of the reality of life in the crack-era inner city, presented with no moral frame, no authorial distance, no attempt to say, "I'm trying not to be like this." The narrator of gangsta rap was inside the chaos. He was the drug dealer. He was the killer. He glorified the behavior that was destroying the community, and in doing so, he captured something real: the seductive power of the street life for young men with no other available scripts for masculine identity. Critically, the values embedded in gangsta rap were the values of the honor culture, the Scots-Irish Southern honor culture that soul traces through white Southern culture into black Southern culture. The absolute primacy of personal respect. The willingness to use violence over any perceived slight. The distrust of authority, institutions, police. The celebration of physical toughness over intellectual achievement. The sexual conquest as masculine validation. These were not African values in any meaningful sense. They were not values specific to the black experience. They were Southern honor culture values, the same values that produced the Hatfield and McCoy feud, the same values that made the American South the most violent region of the country for both black and white residents throughout its history. But in hip-hop, they found a vehicle. And that vehicle reached everywhere. Chapter 15. The commercialization of Southern black masculinity. How the market made one culture dominant. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, something remarkable happened. Hip-hop, which had been born as a northern black urban art form, was captured by the recording industry and repackaged around a set of values that were, in essence, Southern black honor culture values. The reasons were partly commercial and partly demographic. Commercially, the most profitable version of hip-hop was the one that most effectively sold what young people, particularly young white people, who were the majority of rap record buyers, were buying: rebellion, danger, transgression, sexual swagger, violence as style. The suburban white teenager buying gangsta rap records was not buying sociological analysis. He was buying the fantasy of a particular kind of masculinity, one that was coded as authentically black, but was in fact drawn from the specific Southern honor culture tradition. Demographically, as Southern black culture, Atlanta, Houston, the Dirty South, developed its own hip-hop scene in the 1990s, the South's sheer population weight began to assert itself. Atlanta's LaFace Records, Houston's No Limit and Cash Money satellites, the emergence of crunk, trap music, and Southern rap styles gave the Southern black cultural voice a commercial infrastructure it had never had before. The Atlanta story is particularly important. Atlanta had been the center of the black middle-class South, the home of Morehouse College, Spelman College, the historically black college tradition that represented the best of Southern black aspiration. Martin Luther King Jr. was an Atlanta preacher's son. But the Atlanta hip-hop scene that emerged in the late 1990s and exploded in the 2000s, through artists like Lil Jon, T.I., Outkast, who were a magnificent exception in an argument for complexity, Gucci Mane, Young Jeezy, and later Migos, Future, Lil Baby, and 21 Savage, largely packaged the street values of the honor culture: drugs, money, violence, sexual conquest, and ostentatious display. This was not because Atlanta's black community lacked alternatives. It was because the alternatives, the world of Morehouse and Spelman and black civic culture, did not generate commercially viable content for the recording industry. The industry selected for one version of black Southern culture and amplified it globally. Chapter 16. The Cosby Show versus the Streets. The internal culture war in Black America. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Black America was engaged in a fierce internal debate about culture and identity, a debate that largely played out beneath the surface of mainstream cultural discourse, but that was incredibly consequential. On one side were the defenders of what might be called the Northern black tradition of respectability, uplift, and civic participation. Bill Cosby, who spent much of the early 2000s, before his own moral implosion, delivering speeches to black audiences emphasizing parental responsibility, educational achievement, and the abandonment of street culture. Juan Williams, whose book Enough made similar arguments. Orlando Patterson, the Harvard sociologist who wrote about the complex relationship between black youth culture and academic underachievement. John McWhorter, a linguist at Columbia University, made the argument most directly and controversially in his 2000 book Losing the Race. McWhorter argued that a culture of victimology, separatism, and what he called anti-intellectualism, a peer culture that stigmatized academic achievement as acting white, had taken hold in Black America in ways that were doing profound damage to black educational attainment. The acting white phenomenon, the social cost imposed on black students, particularly in urban schools, for doing well academically, is one of the most documented and contested findings in the sociology of education. Economists Roland Fryer and Paul Torelli published research in 2010 finding that among black students in the most segregated schools, higher academic achievement was actually associated with lower social popularity among black peers. This is a heartbreaking finding, and it reflects, at the cultural level, the collision between the Northern black tradition that saw education as the path to freedom and the Southern honor culture tradition that associated academic striving with submission to white authority. On the other side of the internal debate were those who argued that the emphasis on black cultural pathology was itself a form of racism, that had deflected attention from structural factors like residential segregation, underfunded schools, discriminatory policing, and the lingering effects of historical exploitation. This debate has never been resolved, and it has never been resolved because both sides are pointing at real things. The structural factors are real, and the cultural factors are real. Human behavior is shaped by both, and pretending that either doesn't exist produces incomplete analysis. Chapter 17. The South Rises in Music. Atlanta, Houston, and the Trap Takeover. By the 2010s, the debate was largely moot in the domain of popular culture. Southern hip-hop had won. Atlanta had become the undisputed capital of mainstream hip-hop. The trap sound, named for the trap houses, where drugs were sold, was everywhere. Its musical aesthetics, the rapid hi-hat patterns, the thundering 808 bass drums, the auto-tune-drenched vocals, the lyrical focus on drug dealing, violence, designer clothes, and sexual conquest, had become the default sound of American popular music. This was not simply a black American development, it was a global one. Trap-influenced music was being made in London, in Nigeria, in Brazil, in South Korea. The cultural export that America was sending to the world was, in large part, the values of Southern black honor culture, packaged in the most seductive sonic rapping imaginable. Consider what the dominant rap narratives of the 2010s communicated to their audiences. Success is measured in material display, cars, jewelry, brand name clothing. It is not measured in education, professional achievement, or civic contribution. Masculinity is measured in sexual conquest and the capacity for violence. The ability to harm or kill a rival is presented as a form of virtue. The ability to attract multiple women simultaneously is a status symbol. Loyalty is owed to your crew, your neighborhood, your gang, not to institutions, not to society, not to the future. My day ones is the highest term of praise. Authority, police, teachers, parents who align with institutional culture, is the enemy. These are, to a remarkable degree, the values that Sowell traces through Scots-Irish border culture into white Southern culture into black Southern culture. They are not black values, in any universal sense. They are the values of a specific culture in a specific historical context, now massively amplified by commercial music. Chapter 18. The Northern Alternative and its Diminishment. What happened to a different vision of black manhood? It is worth pausing to ask, where did the Northern black cultural tradition go? It did not disappear, but it was marginalized in the cultural marketplace. Hip-hop artists who represented Northern black traditions of complexity, civic responsibility, and intellectual ambition continued to work, but they were increasingly niche rather than mainstream. Kendrick Lamar, from Compton, California, is perhaps the most important counterexample, an artist of extraordinary ambition, moral seriousness, and lyrical complexity who has achieved massive commercial success. His albums Good Kid, M.A.A.D. City, To Pimp a Butterfly, and Damn! Are among the most sophisticated artistic works produced in America in the 21st century. They engage with history, with theology, with psychology, with the complexities of black Southern California life in ways that demand, and reward, close attention. Lamar explicitly wrestles with the tension between the honor culture of the street and the aspiration towards something larger. He does not resolve it neatly, because it cannot be resolved neatly. But he insists on the complexity. J. Cole, from Fayetteville, North Carolina, makes hip-hop that is self-consciously reflective, lyrically complex, and deeply concerned with black male psychology and responsibility. These artists exist. They are celebrated, but they are exceptions to a dominant commercial culture that has largely committed to the Southern honor culture template. The diminishment of the Northern Black cultural tradition in popular culture has not meant the disappearance of Northern Black achievement in other domains. Black Americans continue to dominate in medicine, law, academia, business, and government at levels that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The Obama presidency was, among other things, a monument to the Northern Black tradition of civic engagement, intellectual achievement, and institutional trust. But in the cultural imagination, in the music, in the fashion, in the language, in what it means to be authentically Black, for a generation of young people who have absorbed that question from popular culture, the Southern template has won. Chapter 19. What the data show now. Current outcomes and the persistence of cultural patterns. Let us look at where we are. The educational achievement gap between Black and white American students is one of the most studied and most persistent phenomena in American social science. Despite decades of policy intervention, school busing, Head Start, increased school funding, affirmative action, mentoring programs, the gap stubbornly persists. The gap is not uniform across Black America. Black students in the South, particularly in the Deep South, tend to show lower average educational achievement than Black students in certain northern cities with strong institutional traditions. Black students from West Indian immigrant families consistently outperform both groups. Black students in certain elite urban schools and in suburban integrated schools often perform at or near the level of their white peers. This variation is the important finding. If the achievement gap were purely a function of race, it would not vary this way. It varies because culture varies. It varies because the institutions surrounding students vary. It varies because what students believe about education, whether it is a path to freedom or a form of acting white, varies. Black male incarceration rates remain dramatically higher than those of any other demographic group in America. The causes are multiple: discriminatory policing, economic exclusion, the legacy of crack sentencing disparities. But cultural factors play a role that honest analysis cannot avoid. The specific pattern of violence in Black communities, concentrated in certain urban neighborhoods, often involving young men who know each other, often triggered by perceived disrespect, fits almost exactly the pattern that anthropologists have documented in honor cultures throughout history. It is not random. It is structured by a specific set of cultural rules about masculine status and the appropriate response to threat. This does not mean that policing doesn't matter, or that economic opportunity doesn't matter, or that the history of structural racism doesn't matter. All of those things matter enormously. But they do not fully explain the pattern. Cultural values explain part of it. The Black family has not recovered the stability it had in 1960. Today, roughly 70% of Black children are born to unmarried mothers. This is not simply a Southern or Northern pattern, it is broadly distributed. And it continues to have consequences for the children involved. At the same time, Black America continues to produce extraordinary achievement, in every field, at every level. The Black professional class has grown enormously since the 1960s. Black Americans have been governors, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, CEOs of major corporations, and of course, President of the United States. The coexistence of these two realities, extraordinary achievement by some, concentrated disadvantage for others, is what makes Black America so difficult to analyze honestly without falling into either complacency or despair. George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and the 2020 moment. In May 2020, a Minneapolis police officer named Derek Chauvin knelt on the neck of a Black man named George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, killing him. The murder was recorded on video and seen by hundreds of millions of people around the world. What followed was the largest social protest movement in American history. Millions of people, of all races, took to the streets in every major American city and many international ones. The phrase, Black Lives Matter, which had been coined in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, became the defining slogan of a generation's awakening. The 2020 moment forced America to confront, once again, the unresolved question of anti-Black racism in American institutions, particularly in policing. And it produced a genuine reckoning in many institutions about their relationships with Black Americans. It also produced, within Black America, a complex and sometimes painful internal conversation. Because the communities most devastated by police violence are also often the communities most devastated by street violence. In Chicago in 2020, the year of the George Floyd uprising, more than 700 people were murdered, the vast majority of them Black, and the vast majority of those killings had nothing to do with police. The killer was another young Black man, usually in a dispute rooted in the honor culture of the street. Black community members in these neighborhoods face a genuinely impossible dilemma. They want protection from both police brutality and street violence. They want policing that is effective, fair, and non-lethal. They do not want to choose between safety from the state and safety from the street. The cultural analysis we have been developing throughout this documentary does not provide easy political answers. It does not tell us how to reform policing. It does not tell us how to rebuild the Black family or the Black inner-city economy. What it does is insist that any honest conversation about Black America must engage with both the external factors, racism, historical exploitation, structural disadvantage, and the internal cultural factors that have developed over centuries of interaction with different white cultural environments. To focus only on the external is to deny Black agency and Black culture. To focus only on the internal is to deny the very real and ongoing effects of racism and structural disadvantage. Both truths must be held simultaneously. Chapter 21: The Southern Black Renaissance. What the South got right. It would be a serious mistake to end this story by treating Southern Black culture as simply a deficit. It is not. The South produced the Civil Rights Movement, perhaps the most morally impressive mass movement in American history. It produced the Black Church, the most durable and resourceful institution in African American life. It produced the food, the music, the language, the hospitality, and the humor that are, for most of the world, the face of Black American culture. Southern Black culture's emphasis on community over individualism, on extended family networks, on church as total social institution, on hospitality and generosity. These are genuine strengths. They produced resilience in conditions of extraordinary adversity. They produced mutual aid in the absence of public resources. They produced joy in the face of suffering. The Southern Black church tradition, from the slave praise houses to the Baptist and AIM churches of the Jim Crow era to the megachurches of contemporary Atlanta, has been the single most important institutional force in Black American life. It has educated generations, organized communities, sustained families, produced leaders, and maintained a vision of human dignity in conditions that denied it. Even the honor culture, in its origins, was adaptive. In an environment where no formal institution would protect you, the ability and willingness to protect yourself was survival. The problem was not that the honor culture existed, it was that it persisted long after the conditions that made it necessary had changed. The contemporary South has produced extraordinary Black achievement. Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, and other southern cities have the fastest growing Black middle classes in America. Howard University graduates and HBCU alumni are building careers and institutions across the South. The Black Mecca that Atlanta has claimed to be, aspirationally since the era of John Lewis and Andrew Young, is real in ways it was not a generation ago. The complexity of Southern Black life, the simultaneous presence of trap music and Morehouse College, of street violence and extraordinary entrepreneurship, of crunk and outcast, is not a contradiction. It is a living culture in the midst of a transformation. Chapter 22: North, South, and the Search for Synthesis. What the two traditions can offer each other. The Northern Black tradition gave America Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, and Barack Obama. It gave America the NAACP, the Urban League, the tradition of legal and political struggle for civil rights. It gave America a model of civic engagement, institutional trust, and the use of formal education and professional achievement as tools of liberation. The Southern Black tradition gave America Harriet Tubman, who escaped the plantation and went back to free others. It gave America Fannie Lou Hamer, whose courage in Mississippi in 1964 was grounded in the toughest kind of Southern grit. It gave America the folk wisdom, the music, the food, and the spiritual depth that make Black American culture one of the richest in human history. Neither tradition is pure. Neither is without its dark shadow. The Northern tradition of respectability had its own forms of elitism and colorism and class prejudice. The Southern honor culture, as we have seen, carried within it patterns that were genuinely destructive. But what the best of both traditions share is this: a refusal to accept that Black people are less than fully human, less than fully capable, less than fully deserving of the conditions in which human beings can flourish. That refusal is the core of African American culture at its deepest level. It has expressed itself in different forms, in the courtrooms of Thurgood Marshall and in the music of Robert Johnson, in the scholarship of Thomas Sowell and in the oratory of Martin Luther King Jr., but it is always present. Chapter 23. Hip-hop as Mirror. What the music tells us about where we are. Hip-hop today is not a single thing. It is many things. There is the trap music of Atlanta and Houston that dominates the charts and reflects, in its glorification of street life and conspicuous consumption, the values of the Southern honor culture. There is the conscious hip-hop of Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, Common, and others who use the form to engage seriously with history, with psychology, with the condition of Black America. There is the Afrobeats-influenced pop of artists like Burna Boy and Davido, who bring West African traditions into dialogue with American hip-hop in ways that hint at the reconnection with African cultural roots. There is the R&B-influenced introspective music of Frank Ocean, Tyler the Creator, and others who use Black musical forms to explore individual psychology and identity in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. What hip-hop tells us about where Black America is now is complex. The commercially dominant forms celebrate values that many would consider destructive. But the mere fact that these values are being performed, documented, and argued over, that Black America has the cultural power to make its internal debates the soundtrack of the world, is itself a form of power. The question is not whether Southern Black culture or Northern Black culture will win. The question is what the best of both traditions can produce, together, in full awareness of each other, in honest engagement with history. The answer to that question is not predetermined. It is being written now, in recording studios and college classrooms and church basements and courtrooms and barbershops and social media feeds, by millions of Black Americans who are the inheritors of all of this history and who are making choices, conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, about what comes next. Chapter 24. Conclusion: The Ongoing Experiment. Culture, Choice, and the Future. Thomas Sowell ends many of his books with a similar observation: cultures change. The values and behaviors that seem fixed in one generation are not fixed in the next. What culture produces are patterns and tendencies, not destinies. The Scots-Irish culture of the American backcountry, with all its violence and its distrust of institutions, has changed dramatically in the past 2 centuries. The descendants of the people who settled the Appalachian backcountry are, today, nurses and engineers and teachers and accountants. The honor culture has faded, not disappeared, but faded, in the face of changing economic conditions and cultural pressures. The Jewish immigrant culture that arrived in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, poor, crowded into urban tenements, speaking a language the mainstream didn't understand, transformed itself within 2 generations into one of the most economically and culturally successful populations in American history. Not because of genetics, because of culture, a specific cultural emphasis on education, argument, literacy, and community investment. The West Indian Black immigrants who have come to America in the 20th and 21st centuries, arriving with limited resources but strong cultural values around education and family, have replicated this pattern in miniature. None of this means that racism is not real. None of this means that structural disadvantage doesn't matter. None of this means that policy is irrelevant. All of those things are real and matter. What it means is that culture is real too. And culture can change. The African American story, with all its complexity, its tragedy, its triumph, its 2 great cultural traditions meeting and mixing and arguing and creating, is not a finished story. It is one of the most important ongoing stories in human history. The Northern Black tradition said, "We will master the tools of this civilization and use them for our liberation." The Southern Black tradition said, "We will survive, we will endure, we will maintain our community and our spirit in the face of everything you throw at us." Both were right. Both were necessary. Both produced things of enduring value. The task now is synthesis, finding the forms of Black American culture that can take what is best from both traditions: the intellectual rigor and civic engagement of the North, the communal solidarity and spiritual depth of the South, the aspiration of Thurgood Marshall and the endurance of Fannie Lou Hamer, the complexity of Kendrick Lamar and the joy of James Brown. That synthesis will not be handed down from above. It will not be legislated into existence. It will be created, as Black American culture has always been created, in the daily lives of millions of people making choices about what to value, what to teach their children, what to celebrate, and what to leave behind. The two cultures that have always lived within Black America, the Northern and the Southern, the civic and the communal, the aspirational and the resilient, are not enemies. They never were. They are the two hands of the same people, reaching toward the same horizon. The history we have traced in this documentary, from the slave ships to the plantation, from the Great Migration to the crack epidemic, from the Delta blues to trap music, is not a history of failure. It is a history of an extraordinary people navigating extraordinary conditions, sometimes failing, sometimes triumphing, always adapting, and never entirely giving up on the possibility of something better. That is the African American story. And it is still being written.